What are we doing?
We're going downstairs.
Why?
Because we are.
Why are we so drawn to being disturbed? A hand under the bed, a whisper from the dark. There's something tantalizing about the unknown. Wes Craven described his feelings about the horror genre saying, "The first monster you have to scare the audience with is yourself." Essentially, you take your pains, your griefs, your vices and your fears and transfer them to the screen. Is this why we want so desperately to be scared? Do we ultimately realise that that hand under the bed is ours? Because this desire for the skip of one's heart is so innate, it's easy to realise why horror films are as old as filmmaking itself. The use of horror in images, moving or still, dates back to the 1860s, where entertainers would draw upon ancient folklore and mysterious legends to haul monsters from our dreams into reality. This was the birth of spirit photography, the practice of capturing a ghost, ghoul or demon within an image. Often entertainers would use lighting effects or overexposed images to depict spectral visits. These would then be sold to spiritualists who believed the imaginings were legitimate. As filmmaking was birthed, it became clear these practices would be needed to tell much darker stories on screen. Released in the winter of 1896, Le Manoir Du Diable, which loosely translates to The Haunted Castle, was the earliest recorded version of a horror film. Despite its 3-minute running time, Le Manoir Du Diable manages to make use of all the current horror filmmaking cliches, or indeed, create them. For 20 years, the genre stayed relatively quiet, its true potential uncharted until 1919 when, quote, the granddaddy of horror was released. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was the first true pioneer of the horror genre. Tension grows in an unsettling wave. An ominous villain stalks the scenes and the harsh, jagged sets send stark shadows sprawling athwart the frame. All elements that would come to define horror movies. However, the film's impact extended further than a mere genre. It also played a major role in the German expressionistic movement, which used exaggerated plots and settings to depict dark emotions like madness and confusion. Cabinet incorporates bizarrely shaped buildings and walls at odd angles to create viewer unease. These elemental influences show up in every era of horror filmmaking, from the 1920s sci-fi horror of Metropolis to more modern creations such as the work of Tim Burton. What is perhaps most fascinating about the world of horror filmmaking, and conceivably why it has only grown in prominence, is its ability to target the human anxieties of its time. Nosferatu scares the audience with its depiction of a death-riddled town, a reference to the countless fatalities of the Great War. Dracula hit the screens in 1931, and once more had more to impart than mere vampire tales. The film can be perceived as an allegory of the collapse of British imperialism.
Something so incredible.
And decades later, it's 1979 and we've arrived at Ridley Scott's iconic space horror, Alien. Just 10 years previous, man had journeyed farther into the unknown than ever before, taking its first steps on the moon. This journey produced stimulating and scary questions. Are we alone in the universe? what else could be among us? Scott's answer was not a gentle one. His tale of a crew stuck in space with a bloodthirsty alien quickly became a landmark motion picture.
No, you're out of your mind.
You got a better idea?
Yes. I say that we abandon the ship.
It's interesting to see the turn horror films have now taken in our century. What real fear could they play into? What are we, as a society, questioning most? Could it be ourselves? The 2014 Australian-made film The Babadook certainly believes so. On the one hand, the movie is a classical monster flick with links to early German expressionistic pieces. However, looking at it more closely in relation to the self-reflection ideals of the horror genre, The Babadook is a psychological thriller to horrifying effect. It is, in itself, a story about grief. This grief embroils the protagonist of the film, Amelia, played by Essie Davis, still shattered by the death of her late husband Oscar. Oscar, who constantly revisits her throughout the film, was killed driving Amelia to the hospital to deliver their son Samuel. This presents an immediate divide between mother and son from the film's outset. Amelia always blames Samuel for Oscar's death, even if it may be a subconscious response. And as the Babadook begins to enter their lives through the children's book she reads to Samuel, these feelings begin to surface. These thoughts form a bedrock for the malevolent Babadook to wreak havoc in their home and her mind. Because, as the viewer, you see, the Babadook is not tangible, but instead a psychosomatic display of her grief. It can't physically touch or harm her, giving the director, Jennifer Kent, the difficult task of transmitting the scares another way. Therefore, the Babadook works effectively on a psychological level. Its unsettling nature and brooding tone makes it horror to the extreme, all brought to its zenith in this scene. We hear the first knock, no one there. The second time, Amelia finds the book. This is truly where the Babadook, for both her and the audience, become more than mere fiction. As Samuel was terrified of the Babadook from Amelia's first reading of it, she eventually decided to rip it apart. His constant fear of the illusory creature was clearly marring to her mental health. And yet, here it is, again, on her doorstep. Thus, we are presented with this idea. Something that is perhaps paper thin is powerful enough to become real if it infects the mind. Jennifer Kent proves that simply having an idea, a hint of something unstable, is much more disturbing than having the scare right there, then, in your face. Designing the book as more than a mere story with images, but instead having it pop out, is ingenious. As the audience reads along, it is already as though the Babadook has sprung into their heads. The haunting images simply serve as a seasoning of horror. The evolution of the monster inside of Amelia after, as stated, it has infested her mind. Killing the dog, killing the son, all things Amelia is sure she is not capable of doing. until we cut to her burning the book. The fear is real. She smiles at Samuel, but is it a smile of comfort or one of horrible trepidation? The entire sequence playing out like a wild stage play, the book literally jumping out to greet us. Dark and daunting and in your face, evoking once more German expressionistic roots without the unwelcome blatancy of having the monster in the room. Perspicuous without being clumsy. Now that we've seen that the sequence harks back to classic horror conventions, whilst also subverting into an almost indie class of film, we may analyse it in terms of filmmaking value. We will look at the ways both performance and sound are used within the sequence, how this effect echoes throughout the film, and in turn its genre counterparts. As the scene begins, we see Amelia wandering in a daze, almost deliriously blissful as she checks on Samuel, who is sleeping and heads downstairs. What truly elevates this film above the banality of the genre is the fine lines Amelia treads between joy, grief, and evil. Because of Essie Davis's impeccable portrayal, we know the character is capable of all three. We feel this at this moment, when she appears to be happy, but could something more malevolent be brooding beneath the surface? As the director allows this to play in our minds, we immediately hear our first knock. Of course, we are all familiar with this trope. Doors are commonly used in horror flicks simply because they're false senses of security. A closed door means safety, or does it? This elicits similar uses in films such as A Nightmare on Elm Street. Again, the ever knowledge that something could be lurking on the other side. Thus, Jennifer Kent employs this simple sound, and the viewer is immediately stricken with unease. So, 20 seconds into the sequence, and both performance and sound have already been utilised to great effect. We hear a second knock, louder. She opens the door and... Watch how Davis's performance and the sound show shock at the same time. Thus, with this simple visual cue, the abrupt blast of music and Amelia's display of sudden horror, the sequence jumps into its frightful life. The book is back. She brings the book into the house, and we now hear the stirring score play, matching the pace the sequence is now striding in. She evaluates the book to be certain it is not a hoax, but we already know the truth. Ken has used sound to alert the audience of the danger, even before the character we are watching is fully aware of it. Playing with other expectations is an intelligent choice of direction from Kent, a decision we see a lot of in smart horror flicks. Sometimes the audience is allowed to feel ahead of the film's dangers, only to find moments later that it was all a trap. Look to films such as The Shining as a prime example. A key sequence in the film, the tricycle scene, uses sound or the absence of it to allow the viewer to settle, if only for a moment. It takes time to realise that something is indeed awry. And then, at last, the payoff.
Hello, Danny.
Back to our scene, and the absence of dialogue or diegetic sound from Amelia is yet another clever element from Kent. She simply allows the sequence to play, showing the gore and terrors from the book as the galvanising score and facial work from Davis harmonise together both on and off screen. Amelia's horror grows and grows and grows. She burns the book. The crackling of the flames should bring the viewer comfort, so why doesn't it? The superlative composition of performance and sound are stuck in our minds. The sequence is over, and yet the director has made it certain that our horror is not. So, a scene in a film amid a wide lineup of motion pictures that only fit into one genre. What place does something so seemingly small have in such a rich and masterful array of works? Well, the same could be said for this scene. Did the filmmakers truly know how iconic it would become? How about this one?
Here's Johnny!
How could an image so simple now be etched into film history? Well, using the same tools Jennifer Kent has so eloquently displayed, any director at any time could find themselves living on in horror legend.
Abracadabra!
How did you do that? Give me. Happy birthday, sweetheart.
Hopefully now, it is clear that it doesn't come down to simply showing the audience something scary. A tip most current horror filmmakers fail to pick up on.
It's the best looking found footage film I've ever seen.
In a society so desensitized, having a clown show up around a corner to say boo will never be enough.
Freaking A! What do I do with this?
It's about grace,
Action!
patience, and skill. Not recycled found footage scares in a dimly lit set, but instead an unconquerable demon dancing wildly in the sunlight. Because, funnily enough, horror filmmaking is not about filling the screen with something horrible, nor even showing us how horrible we are.
And I always will.
It is just an answer to the ever-pressing question of, what if? Like all film genres, horror, with groundbreaking movies like The Babadook, will forever strive for peace of mind on the matter. And perhaps that is the scariest thing of all. There will never be any. For all eternity, we will search in the darkest, most horrible corners of the human planet to find nothing.